Hey everyone, Cassius here, welcoming you back to the Shakespeare Minute. Today, as the Hollow Crown continues to give us an amazing depiction of the Henriad, and seeing as tomorrow is the anniversary of the Battle of Shrewsbury, July 21st, 1403, I thought that today would be a perfect time to revisit what I've already established on the Memorial Day episode is my favorite Shakespearean battle. So everyone is pretty much down with the fact that Shakespeare was not writing historically accurate depictions of the things that happened during the time that he treats in his history plays. A lot of the stuff is propaganda or just played up for better artistic purposes. However, let's look at the Battle of Shrewsbury in particular, the actual historical accounts from the records that we have, and see just how true Shakespeare managed to be here. In fact, the one thing that Shakespeare really seems to have fabricated is the Prince Hal versus Harry Percy plotline. In Henry IV Part 1, which culminates in the final two acts being largely about the Battle of Shrewsbury, it's presented as the head-to-head of the Prince of Wales and Hotspur, these two young men, one of whom, the prince, has been drinking in bars for all of his father's reign, and the other of whom, Hotspur, has been this inspirational young warrior, and now they're going to have to fight each other to see who really gets to take up the mantle. While the prince was in fact pretty young at the Battle of Shrewsbury, he was a teenager and it was his first battle, Hotspur was in his late 30s, he was older than the king, and was a veteran. His relationship with Richard II was a lot more than just having been a young man who fought against Richard in the Bolingbroke uprising, as it were. He actually had a long and storied history of being pro-Richard and anti-Richard for much of the end of Richard's reign. So he has a much richer, longer backstory than just I fought with Richard once, now I regret that, and I'm this hot-headed young guy. He was not an age-appropriate foil for the prince. That seems to be the big artistic license that Shakespeare was taking. However, lots of other details that Shakespeare throws in about the lead-in to the battle and the battle's aftermath are actually pretty accurate. To begin with the lead-up to the battle, there's historical records which state that the king was enforced to attack the rebels before they could regroup with the Glendower faction. The play shows us that Glendower did not come down to the battle in time, that he was going to be fighting them later, in Part 2, of course. And also that there was a lot of negotiation before the battle began. Shakespeare does depict this, and it is recorded that Hotspur's uncle, the Earl of Worcester, Thomas Percy, lied about what the king was offering. He went to the king said, "Yes, I will give you everything you want, just please stop attacking us," and Worcester lied to Harry Percy. Now in the play, of course, Hotspur, Harry Percy, is very eager to fight, so he swallows the lie, hook, line, and sinker, and he's ready to go out and fight. Whereas historically the record says that he had to be egged on by the lie, that he did not want to immediately jump into the fight, that he was a little bit more level-headed about it. But then, of course, he was convinced to do so. Now, once the fight begins, this is where the accounts sort of diverge. Shakespeare couldn't really depict a lot of the things in the record because it necessarily focused on larger numbers of people fighting each other, the big charges and everything, whereas Shakespeare is focusing on the one-on-one fights, which didn't really happen. Shrewsbury was a massive battle. There were thousands of casualties. This was a one-day event. New technology was being rolled out. It was one of the first and bloodiest Civil War type altercations for the English, so this was a pretty big deal. Contemporary records show shock at just how bloody and brutal the battle was. The king's army suffered about 3,000 casualties, which was considered just astronomical and mind-blowing for the time. And in fact, the king's army suffered more casualties than the army they defeated. At one point, Harry Percy did lead a specific mission into the enemy lines, at which point Stafford and Blunt, two characters in Shakespeare who are mentioned as dying in the battle, did in fact get killed in this specific mission. But then, of course, so was Harry Percy. He was not killed in a one-on-one fight with the prince, although the prince at this point was leading an army against him, but rather he was killed by a stray arrow. The prince was wounded at this point. That is another detail from the play that is in fact correct. He was struck by an arrow in the face and in fact had to be for several days afterwards treated for this, and medieval medicine can chalk up at least one win because he did not die, and the treatments actually probably did save him. So yeah, that one victory for medieval medicine here. All right, great. And after this, we have the death of Harry Percy and how it was received. The king was also considered to have been killed at this point. There was a lot of confusion. Some people thought Harry Percy had been killed, some people thought the king had been killed, and there were these shouts of victory on both sides. The king started to lead a shout, you know, Harry Percy is dead, and as this sort of rippled through the troops in a moment that I'm so sad that Shakespeare couldn't really depict, obviously, on stage, as it became clear that this was the dominant shout, that Harry Percy was not responding because he was in fact dead. This is what drove it home for a lot of people there. However, after the battle, a lot of people on the field, it was recorded that many people didn't know who had won. And this is another accurate detail that Shakespeare puts in the beginning of Henry IV Part 2, when the Earl of Northumberland is trying to get news from the battlefield and people are confused. Someone's like, well, I spoke with someone who was there and he said that your team won, and then somebody else comes from the battlefield and sets him right and says, no, the king won and your son was killed, because the Earl of Northumberland is Harry Percy's father. So Shakespeare does pepper his play with lots of details. Now, one thing he leaves out, this is a sort of lead-in to the battle thing that he leaves out, but I think it's kind of interesting, is that Hotspur, to garner support for his big battle, actually used the pretty audacious lie that Richard II was still alive and that he might in fact be there on the battlefield with the rebels to fight against his usurper. This was a pretty widespread theory of the time. A lot of people thought that Richard might still be alive. He'd been deposed and reported dead, but you know, maybe he was still alive, maybe there was a chance he'd come back. And for a while after he died, there was this thought. Henry IV tried to tamp down these rumors by actually showing Richard's body publicly, but I mean, we still today don't like to accept what we're shown when we want to think that our leaders are lying to us, so he had some trouble with that as well, especially in the age when it was hard to disseminate information. So Harry Percy played on this a lot. That, of course, was omitted from the play because it is very clear to everybody in the play that Richard is in fact dead. There was no real playing with that in Shakespeare's tetralogy. That wouldn't have worked with what he was trying to say. So that is the Battle of Shrewsbury. A lot of stuff that Shakespeare puts in is true. The stuff that he leaves out, of course, is the big battlefield moments with hundreds and thousands of people coming together to do stuff, but of course he couldn't really show that. So he simplified it to a few one-on-one fights that did not happen. But the details about the negotiations and the way that the confusion sort of spread all over the place after the battle was in fact true. This was a huge, disastrous, cataclysmic event, and Shakespeare does get that across however he can. And I think it's kind of cool that this happens to be one of the more accurate events in the Shakespeare histories. So with that, happy Battle of Shrewsbury anniversary tomorrow on the 21st. Oh, before I sign off, I just want to let you know I have linked to two things in the description. Number one, from English Heritage, that is a historical society, I have linked a PDF which has a whole description of the battle and the battlefield, a lot of great historical information in case you're interested, and I have also linked to my discussion of Shakespeare's Battle of Shrewsbury, my Memorial Day episode where I talk through 5 moments on the battlefield that Shakespeare gives us to create his entire battlefield world here at the end of Henry IV Part 1. Till next time here on the Shakespeare Minute, I'm Cassius. Think of the world.